Hello, and welcome to an Onyx Table Talk. I'm Lynx of Onyx Mid-Atlantic, and we are back for part 3 in the Black Lives Matter and leather culture discussion. In this segment, we're going to zoom in and look specifically at race and sexuality as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement and our community as leather people. Joining us for this conversation, I'm so happy to have and introduces our panel today from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Stephen Bailous. From the great state of Ohio, Councilor Ochumaré. Joining us from the DMV, Mr. Blue and Blue Frost. And from Chicago, Illinois, Major Minor. Providing ASL interpretation today, we have returning Ms. Lashonda Lawyer, and for the first time, Ms. Tanasha Olumoya. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for being a part of today's talk. We have a lot to get to, so we'll jump right in. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw the question out there, and however you feel compelled to chime in as an answer, feel free to do so. So our first question on today's list, number one, how has being a person of color affected your journey, your path, and participation in the leather community? Anyone can go.
I guess I'll go. It's impacted my journey in a way that I don't think it's impacted a lot of others, in the fact that I think that I've always felt a sense of protection. I grew up in Onyx. I've always been around the members of Onyx. So my leather journey is very different from a lot of other people, where I always had people around me that always wanted to look out for my best interests, and were always in the background making sure that I didn't fall through the net, right? So I think that, my journey has always been something of like always elevation and growth and protection, but in a way I guess it's kind of stifled me in a little bit, because I didn't venture too far out from where home was. Right. And I think that's always a safety thing. Like, I always felt safe, but I always felt like maybe I need to branch out a little bit more and escape a little bit of that net so that I can evolve. So I think it's been kind of like a double-edged sword, but all in all, it's been very impactful to always have a family.
Thank you.
I think it's made an incredible difference because, racism still exists in every aspect of our community. And being a person of color, going out into the leather community, you still venture into places where if you're not known, when you go to a new place, they still look at you as something like the other, the odd man out. Being a person of color has always been something that I've had to be conscious of. Once you get known, and actually you get known as an Onyx man in the leather community, actually it becomes a place that actually gives you a certain amount of stature. So it's really changed being a part of Onyx, and walking in with an Onyx vest makes a huge difference.
I'd like to chime in a little bit to give you a different perspective as I guess a heterosexual male that's not a member of Onyx, but I have plenty of associates and friends that are in Onyx. Being a person of color for me is exactly like Daddy Steve said. Having traveled the country during title holding years and just in general, visiting conferences, Daddy Steve said you have to be cognizant or conscious of your race and ethnicity when you're in these spaces. He's absolutely right. I've been to many a conference where I've literally been the only person of color male in the space, and I'm talking hundreds of people. So when those instances for me, I'm immediately aware of the situation, being a person of color, being a man of color, regardless of what the space is, or who it's designated for. But just knowing who I am, what my responsibility is to the people of color that are not there, those are the types of things that I think about, because what my representation, just being in a space and being the only one, it transcends to a lot of people, a lot of other people behind me. We're not monolithic by any stretch, but in those spaces, the potential for that to be the case is great.
Blue Frost?
It hasn't, my journey, it hasn't necessarily affected me. And I'll say, because by the time Getting into the kink community was a little harsher for me than the leather community. By the time I made that step over into the leather community, I had pretty much already a name. And so once you have a name, you kind of have some protection and some of the safeties that go along with that. But definitely when I first stepped into the kink community, I have to say the first time I stepped into the bar, I was one of 2 Black women there. And so the immediate thought process for different people are different things. So they're projecting that on you without even knowing who you are at all.
Absolutely. Counselor?
I don't know if you can hear you.
Oh, there we go. Oh, were you muted? Are you muted?
Okay, can you hear me now?
On mute.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Perfect. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So I connect to creative entities, to kind of illustrate my journey. One of them is Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man. And the other one is Tongues Untied, which Exodus Hemphill was a part of. And that came out in 1989. And tell you how long ago that was, I watched that in PBS and public broadcasting that had to come on at 11 p.m. because of its content. And it was Black and it was gay. But I reference Invisible Man as a part of my journey as a Black man who went to college in Cincinnati, Ohio during the 80s. And also was someone who was a part of forced busing, desegregation in the late 70s in Cleveland, Ohio. A lot of the things that have occurred with me is about self-actualization. When I was younger, I was completely aware that I was Black. Certainly those type of things were instilled in me with my sisters and my mother. But where the challenge came is how I navigate, how I experienced and perceived racism and prejudice. And the older I get, the more that I find that those perpetrators have less an effect on me in certain ways than if I was younger. Because for me, at the end of the day, what they want to do is try to get you to react and to be fearful. And once I got my degree in industrial design from the University of Cincinnati, and then keep in mind, I had a professor tell me that he didn't see many Blacks in the art field because he didn't think that they could design. And this was from a white professor. In fact, he led the design department, and much to, I wouldn't say much to their dismay, but they ran out of stuff to do to me. I got my degree anyway. So it becomes for me about analyzing the threat level and governing myself accordingly as a Black man. That's the best way to put it for me.
Cool. Thank you. That's actually a great segue into our next question. Where do you see, or where do race relations within the leather community stand, compared to the LGBT and, cis-het gendered community at large against our larger population of Americans and the world populace? Do you think that there's a difference in how race is viewed in our own little segment, or is it just a reflection of what's going on a broader scale?
My perspective on that is that, kink and BDSM is really just a microcosm of the greater community. So you're going to have some of those same actions, bad actors, bad intentions, good actors within kink, just like you would in a larger community. I think it's a little naive for people to think that we're shielded from that, because we're not. The same struggles we have, walking around in this brown skin within kink could be some of the same struggles we, face outside of kink. So I think it's the same.
I actually agree with you, Mr. Blue. And we have the same thing. The only thing that makes the leather community a little safer is that most of us who walk into this community develop a circle of friends, and we go to the same places again and again and again. And familiarity and having that circle of friends kind of gives us a certain level of protection. Whereas in the greater community, we just kind of are out there and exposed, and we don't always have that protection of a circle or the same protection we have when we keep going back to our favorite restaurants and businesses where you're a known entity. Those relationships make all the difference in the world. But where you don't have already existing relationships or protections, you're vulnerable to every racist piece of prejudice that anyone and everyone is exposed to, especially if you're a Black gay man.
I want to agree with Mr. Blue and Daddy Steve. So, this is the presentation where you sort of said we could go in.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go in. I have found it incredible, but I understand it, that there is any inclination that the leather community is different than any other community when it comes to how people view race and misogyny, because I will add that in there as well, of whether that is any different in this community when it's made up of the same people. The question becomes, how do you roll with it? Particularly what's going on now in this pandemic. And somehow we have these white friends that we're all of a sudden clutching our pearls because they express some things that we probably didn't note before that they had in terms of their behaviors or how they feel about Black people. Like there's a limit to how much they'll go to the mat for you. And gender and sexual orientation doesn't have anything to do with it. I find there to be absolutely no difference whatsoever in any of those communities when it comes to race relations. There isn't. What you have for me in the leather community is maybe some hyped up sexuality, but in terms of the attitudes, I personally have not seen any difference whatsoever. What may be different is our expectations of the people who are within our community as opposed to without. But I personally, there's no difference.
When I think about this question, I think about the idea of community, and I think about the idea of it's kind of echoing this idea of like the microcosm. Like it's like the constant shrinking of this community, right? The larger community being the LGBTQ community, and then we shrink it down to the leather, the kink, the BDSM community. And the one thing that I think about is the level of resources and the level of, visuality, like what they see. And I think that the larger community has done a great job with trying to make everybody visible. And I think the problem that we have is as we continue to break down into those subgroups, it becomes harder to connect with people that we find that are similar to us, especially in subgroups of people of color. We do a great job with saying like, okay, we include Black and brown people within this larger community of being queer and being Black. But then when we talk about subgroups of, let's say, Black pups, or we talk about subgroups of like people who are Black and brown people who are just into kink and not into leather, that then the visibility then becomes scarce. So I think when we talk about race relations, we also need to think about like the amount of visibility that we're putting forth into the community as far as Black and brown people and how we need to advocate for those groups.
That's a really good point.
And it's unfortunate. We discriminate even in our own community as much as there is outside of the world. We've got, Kinksters who are, you would think because we've already been outsiders, we would be more accepting of one another, but those lessons don't translate. We still discriminate within our community against each other. We've got Kinksters who don't care for the pups, who don't care for the folks who are trans, who don't care for those who are the furries, who don't care for those who, mix the gender identity in their presentation. And so, we've got all those same biases within our community. And I'll be honest, that's really disappointing. And we've got a lot of work to do to overcome some of that. we've got to do better.
I agree.
If
No,
I
please. You muted. There you go.
if I may add something really quickly to that, you know, but my question, Daddy Steve, um, I like to call you my brother Steve because
That's fine. That's an honor. You
you
can
know,
always call me brother.
but keep in mind, this is the thing for me is, you know, we are involved in some kink and fetish, which is not going to be the topic of discussion at Olivet Institutional Baptist Church in Cleveland, Ohio. So it's not as if the Black community in general would be accepting us and our kinks. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's not surprise behavior. What do we do to adapt to that? And is it a Black behavior that we should change, or is it a human condition that exists that we must adapt to in order to feel safe around the people that we want to be safe around? You know, that's the question that I have. I just, you know, what in this political talk that we're having, you know, during this political season, yes, certain candidates may speak well of the LGBTQ community, but, you know, do they do that 24/7? No, I don't know. So how do we adapt to that? How do we adapt to that reality? And I guess in my view.
And then, you know, the follow-up to that is, are we the ones that should be doing the adapting, right? I mean, all we're really doing is living what we claim to be our leather lives, you know, however they manifest and in whatever form of expression they take. All we really are doing is living, just the same as those who refuse to accept or understand or even pose the question about why or how. We're met with this resistance because it's not the way or their way or whomever's way. We're met with this challenge of begging, almost cracking our throats at just being seen, you know, and why are we the ones that have to bend and mold and adjust and shrink ourselves to be accepted? You know, I don't know. It's just when you said that, it sort of that popped up in my head as a follow-up to that
I don't
idea.
think we have to shrink ourselves in order to be accepted. I think what we need to do is gain enough confidence in who we are and how we are so we can walk through the world giving ourselves permission and under our own authority. We don't necessarily need someone else's permission to be ourselves. We've got to be self-confident enough to be able to walk through this world under our own steam, under our own authority. And if someone accepts us, great. If they don't, it's not my problem.
I'm glad you said that, Daddy Steve.
Amen. Amen.
Myself and some others that I know, we've all been saying the same thing. We don't need your permission. We absolutely don't need your permission. The fact that I'm here is good enough. Counselor said something about 10 minutes ago. He said what the issue is the expectation that we have that people inside the community are better than the people outside of the community. And I'm going to use community loosely, but it's the expectation. Why is that expectation there? Is because the people on this call more than likely are living upright. They're living in a life, they're living in their integrity, and they expect other people to do the same. So when you're in this community and you see people that are acting out because of race or any other type of prejudice, you're like, what's that about? That's not what we're here for. We're not necessarily identifying with the mainstream community 24/7 because of of the things that we do, you know, and we expect people within this community to have the same integrity and morals that we do. And we know that's not the case, but the expectation is what I wanted to chime in on for counsel.
And I think it's also it's the expectation, but I think it's also holding those individuals also accountable for that expectation. Because I think a lot of times, we can live in our truth because we are confident in who we are, but we also need to hold those individuals accountable for the actions that they place on other people and the expectations that they place on other people. I think that in this community, we don't do enough promoting of others that we feel are different. And especially amongst like trans people, and trans Black people. And I feel like it's such a strong thing to just tell somebody, hey, that's not okay. Or hey, stop it. Or hey, I don't think that's appropriate. And I think we don't do enough of that because we're afraid of checking someone's ego, or we're afraid of the confrontation. But I think the more we are proud of ourselves, we also need to be proud of our community and be proud of the diverseness of our community and actually advocate for it.
Major Minor, you can have it because I'm tired. I have to give you the mantle to carry on the task of leading us to freedom because I'm tired.
Oh, I completely understand.
But you know, I feel so much of what you're saying because I agree with you, and it's a level of disappointment. It also can be a very lofty task, because I'm of the view that if you want to defend the people, that you also need to have a valuable, real relationship with the people that you're saying that you're defending. I love the fact that there are white folks and people out there that were protesting on my behalf, but they don't call and check on me to see how I'm doing. So I'm like, okay. You know, and my sexuality has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
They, you know, that's just, if they don't have a valued relationship, and I can count on one hand who does, and that who are white, you know, how do you defend them? So you're absolutely right, Major Minor. I also think that those relationships need to be developed and not window dressing. I mean, have those relationships.
We talk a lot about that in the sense of having context, perspective, and then understanding. So if you have the proper context for anything that you may want to know about. So we see things in these quick little blurbs and memes and things of that nature without a broader context of what the whole situation is. So if we dig in to find out what the context is, we can get the perspective of those. We can speak with them, get their perspective, and come to an understanding. Oh, now I get it. We don't live in the shoes of every individual. Every individual's experience is also not the same just because they may carry the same moniker or gender identity or expression. So if you want to, you have to actually develop those relationships, talk to those people, get context, get perspective and understanding. And sometimes you have to give that. I know sometimes we get tired of having to say, well, I have to explain myself again, or I have to do this one more time. I don't want to have to say not one more time what my pronoun is. But that person may not have gotten it. So we understand that sometimes that it is tough, you know, and we do get tired. That's why we do try to rotate it around generations and have those things passed down to folks who do have the bandwidth when they do have the capacity. But if you can gain that context, that perspective, we can come to an understanding and move forward in a way that will be powerful.
I want to pass around a collection plate.
I love that.
I do too. Since we brought up white people, let's talk about them for a little bit. Moving on. Our next question. What is something that you wish white people would consider more when it comes to these public displays of symbols and accessories that were historically viewed as racist paraphernalia? An example would be, you know, people that tout the Confederate flag or that insignia, or, you know, bringing it into the culture a little bit more, the idea of the whips and the chains and the hoods and the collars or the swastikas and all these things that historically have suggested or projected a racist undertone. What do you wish that they would think about more before they so broadly just did their thing in public?
Unpopular opinion, I wish they would have told me or showed me earlier than whenever it is that they showed it to me. Meaning, tell me who you are so I'll know how to act accordingly. I don't need you to reconsider, rethink you being your authentic self because I'm going to be mine. Just tell me who you are and tell me as soon as possible so I can make my decision.
Right on.
Many of them embrace those symbols as embracing their own heritage, their own privilege, and they're very, very proud of it. Sometimes they're oblivious to how it impacts and affects someone else. And I wish they would be a little more conscious about what does this mean to the person who's viewing it. It's not sometimes when you're wearing stuff and signifying and you're waving a flag, what kind of statement are you making and how does the rest of the world perceive that? Sometimes I don't think they're aware of the message that they're giving.
Do you think they care?
Sending.
But do you think they care though? This is my flag. This is my heritage. Do they care how other people receive it? I mean, are they entitled to be who they are, just the way that we are? And, you know, pardon the language, but damn anyone else who has a problem with it. I'm going to be me, because that's the answer that we'll get, right?
Listen, I think in the world, there is a certain level of empathy that people need to have for other people, period. I think we're in crazy times. We're around the world, like the world is just an uproar. And it's hard to ask that from people, right? Either people get it or they don't. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of times, that level of empathy, we have to project it so much more because we have idiots out there that aren't going to do it. You know what I mean? So I think it's hard, right? It is a hard balance to say, hey, that's not okay. I don't feel comfortable doing that. And then you have somebody on the other side where it's like, well, I don't care. You know, at that point, if you don't care, then it's like, okay, then I ain't going, you know, at that point, you're kind of X'd out from like everybody, right? And I think that's what happens is like a lot of times we need to, how I feel about it is when people, there is a certain level of empathy. Like I get like with the Confederate flag, I get the Southern pride thing. I get like it's a thing of your past and you want to be proud of the South, and I get it. But you also, yeah, it's like that level of empathy of understanding. Not everybody deems that as okay. Some people find that really insensitive. You should really watch how you do it. And I don't know what you say to people that say that I don't care. I guess you just leave them alone. I guess you let them do their own thing. But yeah, I think it is definitely a certain level of empathy that people should have.
I think we can tell them that there is a certain amount of offense taken when they throw that flag in your face. I understand that you have certain things to be proud of, and I'm not saying that they should not be proud, but they have to be considerate of other people as well. I'm very proud of being Black. But I don't, always. Well, I don't have enough power behind that to actually do anything to that harms white people, unfortunately. And unfortunately, they do have that privilege and power. They do have the ability to call the police on anything from me walking across the street, and I can be arrested immediately. I can be stopped for whatever and harassed. So they have to understand that there's when they reclaim that and claim that and are proud of it, that it is off-putting and can be dangerous to other people. They've got to understand how it impacts folks. They've got to have some compassion.
So for me, I think of the word generalization of white folks, and trust me, I am not defending white folks, so please don't come for me. What I'm going to say is a couple of things. I talked about earlier about determining my threat level. And one of my first experiences of being called the N-word was said by a white child who was probably 9 or 8 years old, probably 7 if truth be told, or 6. And I was in a supermarket in northern Kentucky with my white college mate friend. And she was furious when he said it, and his father was smiling at him because he was doing what his white father wanted him to do. Now, the quick end to that story is that they went to the other side of the supermarket and the boy's mother slapped the shit out of him in his face. And then he started crying. We had left the supermarket, but I thought about that experience because that horrible word came from somebody insignificant to me, except that he may grow up to be my enemy or not. But the threat level, some of these people, we have so much information. It's clearly demonstrated by Facebook and all these other things for people to know what those symbols are, what those symbols mean to us as people of color. They could find out if they wanted to. So we're dealing with people who don't want to do the work. So how do you adapt to dealing with those people who don't want to do the work? If they're no threat level to me, I could care less. They could evaporate to the four winds for all I care. But if somebody is a determined threat level to me, they're going to understand that that is how I feel about that particular symbol. These people are not my friends or their acquaintances or whatever you want to call them, or I don't deal with them one bit. And even during this pandemic, I've had to let some people go simply because of, you're talking about this president and how this is awful, but I know how you've dealt with them whenever we talk about racist symbols. So it really depends on, to me, I take it the immediate threat level. If it's an immediate threat level, what do you do? If it is a group of folks out in the Himalayas or whatever, who cares? When it comes out protesting and then somebody gets shot and run over, that's a problem. And we don't have the political leadership at this present time to be able to back us up. So, take care of yourselves and defend yourselves however we can. But what is the particular threat level, I always ask with this particular type of situation? If it's somebody close to you, if it's somebody within our organizations, I say plural, it needs to be dealt with if that organization has a policy and procedure to deal with it. If you don't, we have what we have now. And even within, all of our organizations that exist.
Thank you. The next question is going to sort of piggyback off this last one a little bit. Do you find that today's climate regarding race has, unearthed some harsh truths that we got to face when it comes to people that we once thought were friends or supporters or comrades? You mentioned this a bit earlier, Counselor, and you too, Daddy Steve, that, because of everything going on this summer with the beginning of Black Lives Matter's rise to fame, as it were, we've started to see people really show themselves, right? Whether it be on social media or in any other way, we've had to sort of cock our head to the side and say, I didn't know that you felt that way. Now that I know, is there some work I need to do to keep you at a distance? Has any of that happened to any of you, or do you have any thoughts on that idea?
Lynx, I'll say something really quickly, and because I want to hear from the others, and add to this. How do you feel if it seemed like they were supporting the protesting, but their concern was more about the property damage than the death? Than the death of a Black man, and their concern is the property damage. And yes, I said it.
Yeah, I was going to go there. I've had to distance myself from quite a few people because I think when the protests happened, when the protests started happening here in Chicago, and there was plenty of looting and plenty of destruction of damage, I was a firm advocate for it. And I'll be honest, I was and I still am a firm advocate for it, because there is no amount of damage that will equate to lost lives. There is no amount of, I don't care who burned down what or who destroyed what. People are dying. Black people are dying, and there's no amount of money that you can put toward a life. So I had to distance myself from a lot of people who didn't necessarily agree with the damage or the violence, and I'll put it violence, and I will quote MLK on this. Violence is only the language of people that haven't been heard. You know what I mean? And I'm probably paraphrasing that, but it's the truth. How many more times do we have to see this happen before we actually expect change? And what are we willing to do for that change? And yeah, I had to distance myself from quite a few people that didn't believe the same ideology that I believe in. But to this day, I stand high in how I believe. And I think that people are justified in wanting change. And I feel like when people's voices aren't heard, they're justified in doing that by any means necessary.
I think so much of what we have seen this year has just emboldened our racist friends, our colleagues, I can't call them friends when they do that, but people to just show their true selves, as Maya Angelou would say, when people show you who they are, believe them. And so we have to be clear about that. These folks have had long prejudices that have been there a long time. They're just now emboldened in order to show it. There used to be a lot of things that they weren't allowed to say in public, that these were things that were held in private, which is probably where that little boy you encountered in the grocery store picked that term up. He picked that up at home. He didn't make that comment in the store because he learned it in the store. He probably learned it at home, and his father probably taught it to him. So we have to be careful with that. We also have to make sure that when people talk about the damage that's been done about property and the looting and all that, I think a lot of that is diversion, because it keeps us from talking about what is really the issue. Why are we not talking about why people are protesting in the first place? That's a great way to just change the subject and have something to say and avoid the real problem.
Right. If you didn't kill us, we wouldn't have to burn anything down. And quite frankly, and this is just my opinion, insurance is going to pick that up. I'm quite sure. Insurance, so some of it at least. But at what point do you think there can be a compromise where the person who is pro-destruction, pro-burn it down because we're justified versus or juxtaposed against the person who's like peaceful, march, no need to burn, no need to harm, no need to destroy? I don't even know the answer to the question, but is there a happy medium where both theories can come together and then move forward?
First, can I push back on who's actually doing the harm and destroying property? I believe that most of the protests are peaceful people protesting. We've got a lot of folks who are coming in who are right-wing extremists actually doing a lot of the burning and looting in order to discredit our protests. So if you look at the images on the internet, who's burning, who's shooting, who are the real terrorists in this country? And I will call them that because they allow a 17-year-old boy to walk down the street and shoot protesters. And then they take him home for a sandwich before on the way to court. If it had been me, I'd have been dead in the street.
Right there. Yeah.
I think there is a happy medium. I think that raising our voices, I've been to several protests already, and I think the level of raising our voices and making it aware that a lot of the things that are wrong is the right approach. Now, I think that, like you said, majority of the protests that have happened have been peaceful. They have been peaceful. And there have been times where people are down. And I think it's also the aspect of it is that you have to look at the people that are actually doing the damage. But I think it's also, you have to ask those questions. Why are these people doing the damage? Why are they looting? Why are they doing these things? And half the time, it's because a lot of the times, or a majority of the time, it's because these individuals don't have access to the stuff in which they're looting. If they had access to it, they wouldn't be looting it in the first place. So we also have that's an even deeper conversation that can be alluded. But we also have to think about that as well. That if people had access to these things, why would they have the need to loot them or to take them from other people?
Also, I want to make the point that the media streams what sells, right? So a couple of you all mentioned the fact that there's a certain group of people that are actually out there protesting. That's true, but there are just as many, if not 10 times as more, that are doing peaceful protesting, right? That part doesn't always make the news. So the storylines are guided by what sells. The storylines are sensationalized, to set the narrative. Back to your original question, though, Lynx, you asked, find that today's climate regarding race has unearthed some hard truths, blah, 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 considering these people once comrades. My original thought to that, the answer to that question is this is what happens when people no longer value the meaning of real relationships. Some of these surprises that you get, if you had a real relationship with the person, someone you talk to on the phone, someone you go to lunch with, someone you live your life choice with, and you live out real time, some of these things will become evident way before it becomes a surprise that a comrade is now with the BLM movement. I think that a lot of people, including myself at times, have put much more stock in virtual and online relationships than the people that are right near you in your own community. So to answer your question, I think that the value goes back to the relationship and understanding who you're actually dealing with versus the inferred relationship or understanding that you have with someone.
Right. So like there's a total difference between people that you come across virtually or at conferences or however it is that you come across them. You know, we all get the Facebook friend requests and you have 38 in commons, but you don't know this person at all. So that's no reason for you to push that, yeah, we'll be friends. I'm very, very selective on my friends list because for that very reason. At 38 of my friends know you, and that's awesome. If I get to meet you around, then you can become one of my friends.
Hey.
I'm no longer blindsided by that because those 38 people's choices to be your friend. It's not my choice. So for me, I'm super happy to say through this process that I haven't had a problem with anybody who I considered in my circle. Right. I've not been surprised. I have not been bulldozed. Right. And that's because I talked to these people before I put them into what I would consider comrades or friendship circle, cone of silence, whatever it is you want to call your group. That's how I monitor that. So it's not a thing where it's like, oh, well, I just want to be a friend with the friend of everybody else. So they just want a title. Let me click and be their friend or what. I don't necessarily, subscribe to that philosophy so that I can't get run over by a bus that I didn't even wait to catch.
Amen. I love it. And that's the thing. I think that because of social media and because of the I guess the way that it's taken off, the numbers become the thing, right? I have 5,000 Facebook friends, so there's some weight and merit in that number. Well, how many of those people do you really know, right? How many of those people know your favorite color or know that your biggest fear is the spider? Of course, right? Do they really know you? So then, fast forward 4 or 5 months later, now my Facebook feed is full of screenshots. Oh my God, such and such said this. We have to go now cancel them because they said this horrible thing. Well, did you know that they said that horrible thing 5 months before you took their friendship? Right. Probably not. So it's that whole vetting of friends, right? Cool. So no. Go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, if I may add, first of all, I'll be attending the sermon that the Mr. Blue and Blue Frost are putting out because y'all are preaching today. This is what I'm going to say. Facebook was not created by us or for us. I have a rule of thumb. I don't believe in giving people the power of my destruction if they played no part in my creation, period. That's what I live by. So why on earth has the value of friends on a button on an entity of which is is not for me and by me, right, and edifying the community? Why on earth would I give that any power whatsoever? I refuse. And there's just no way. And I won't go into detail except I've had challenges with people who I said sort of flipped. But at the same time, prior to this pandemic, I kind of had their number in the way that Blue Frost had spoken about. We in the desire to not be alone and to have people around you, we see, there's this, oh, we like this. A sexual connection does not equal a healthy connection. So just because they may have hit it or I hit it good doesn't mean there's going to be a commitment ceremony. It's just not, it's not there. But I understand that behavior because I used to think that way when I was a young teenager, discovering my sexuality. My whole being was in the act of sexuality. And when someone turned it down who was white, I thought I was a failure. But part of that was not me being fully educated and acclimated to myself. And I defer to Tongues Untied, where Exodus Hemphill talk about he discovered the beauty in himself when he discovered the beauty of the Black brother or vice versa. And that's what happened with me throughout my journey in my teens and 20s. Because it makes no sense to me, these relationships that are developed outside of this. And Blue Frost spoke to it. That will be the ruin
Mm.
of
Mhm.
quite a few things, if truth be told,
Mhm.
before some white person comes up and tries to do something to us.
Right on. You know what? Since you touched on sexuality, let's turn the scale a little bit toward that, right? Over the I don't know, since I've been in leather 5 or 6 years or now, there's always been a conversation. There's always been a debate about preference versus prejudice / racist. You know, it's okay to fawn over the light skinned guy or the body boy or the money man or what have you, fill in the blank. I want to know what your thoughts are on that debate. You know, how do you explain to someone who asks, or if you hear it, this idea of preference versus prejudice? Is there a difference, or is it just dressing in the window?
There's a fine line, and everybody was quiet, so I'm just going to jump in. I'll be the first one into the pool. Because there's a fine line, because very often when people say preference, it is a showing of their particular prejudice. So there isn't. But we all have preferences. I know what I like. There are certain body types. There's certain intellects that I'm drawn to, and those are preferences. But you have to be very discerning and be careful, because you don't know if that preference really is a reflection of their prejudice. And it's a fine line, and very often it's the prejudice.
I think there's a fine line when we talk about preference, racism, and pattern. Because I think what we also don't understand is that when we talk about, I think everyone has prejudices and everyone has preferences, but when those preferences then become the norm of like your dating pool or the norm, and it becomes like a practice thing where it's like you don't even acknowledge what else is out there because you're so fixated on that, then I think it becomes like a little bit of like a mental thing. I think it becomes a little bit of like a subconscious, maybe you need to take a deeper look at yourself and like why you're only doing this to these individuals. But I think it's fine to have preference. I think it's fine that as individuals, as humans, we all have our own biases, we all have our own prejudice. But I think we also need to understand that if you see somebody with a certain pattern, you should really pay attention, because that to me is like a red flag. I don't think I would ever, if I notice a pattern with somebody as far as like their dating pool or who they associate themselves with or who they're in bed with or who that kind of thing, then it's a red flag. It'll always be a red flag for me.
When you cut off an entire group of human beings, though, like when I first started dating, period, I was told, "Oh, I'm not into black men." Is it me or the entire populace of black men? Right? That's not a preference.
It's not
at all in my mind. That you are literally slaying an entire group of people. So for me then to turn around and say I'm not into fill in the blank, that's harmful to a whole subset of human beings that will never know me. So, I think that it's an important question. And I think that I agree with both of you and probably all of you when you respond that we have to be careful with how we define what we're into, because we run the risk of excluding, groups of people that we never get to know. And it might be that one person that was written for us that we won't even ever meet because we're not into that. I believe that we're all put here to be with someone or many people or whatever. But if I shut my mind off to XYZ, I'll never meet that person. So I miss my blessing, right?
Or curse.
Or curse.
When do we determine, or when do we find out a person's preference becomes a prejudice? Is there a nefarious act or inference there that signifies the one between the other, like that fine line that Daddy Steve said? Like, I have preferences. I have preferences in food. I have a preference that I like a banana, more than I might like an apple. But does that mean that I am now prejudiced against the apple? If you have a nefarious intent, that becomes the definition of prejudice. That becomes where the issue is. That's where it becomes the consternation between you and whoever you're having a conversation with, or the person that feels prejudiced against. So I think that having a preference is absolutely fine. We're all individuals. We all have our own likes and dislikes. I think the fine line comes when your preference becomes nefarious towards a person or thing outside of what you have a preference for.
That's well said. This is a question that I've had to ask myself, when I was younger, because I used to, in giving you a revelation about myself, younger, in journeying and discovering my sexuality, what I saw around 18 or 19 years in porn were white men mostly. And so in that time, that's what I thought was the mecca of acceptance for who I was. And when I had rejection from that, I didn't know how to handle it. And I was rejected. And sometimes it was because of my race. And again, I dealt with that almost 30 years ago. But I understand the feeling that it was. So when I hear that people have preferences, one of the things I came to understand is that I can do visual ownership if I'm attracted to someone and they must be attracted to me. That doesn't exist. That type of automatic ownership doesn't exist. So, I go back to what I said previously, is that, I take it on a case by case basis. If this person is on some internet program or apps, as the youngins call it, saying, no blacks, I don't know this person. I could care less. So I'm not giving them any power for me to be upset because they have no relevance to me whatsoever. I don't know them. So what I will say is that if I do know these people and, how they behave socially, sometimes the preference is they do like black folks, but what they like are black dick and could care less about how you feel as a person.
Who you are as a person.
That is what I've had to rail against. That is what I've had people who have been shifty, and those people are good. Oh, Ben, I hope you're doing okay. But then it ain't about me. So that is where it's an issue. It isn't so much that the people who say that they're not interested in me that because of my color. I find a challenge with people who say that they are interested in me because of my color. And then I'm challenging that. And I'm like, why? Because I've been in a relationship with a white man. And it has been the idea of being in a relationship and not about who I was as a person.
Nice. Thank you. I'm going to ask this question, and we sort of touched on this in the very beginning, but I want to dig down and get some more thoughts on this. The leather community is a space where radically sexual people can gather to explore and do other things, right? If we are supposedly, as you mentioned, Daddy Steve, this collective group of others, outsiders, then we should understand what it feels to be considered other or different or outsiders. Why then are we still reckoning with race within our own community of others? Why is that still a problem?
Because some of us don't view ourselves as others. I mean, some of us, even in this community, some of us still have privilege. Because, I mean, you can't take this color off. You can't put it on. Well, you could put it on, but I think that's the problem. When we don't consider ourselves equal or just as to other people within this community, that's when you have this divide. Yeah, we're all here. Yeah, we're all expressing ourselves in this way. But it wasn't, part of it was because we were ousted from the general collective. But even within, it's like, we're a subgroup of the bigger community. So you're always going to have those individuals that feel like they're more than or less than what they should be treated and how they should act.
So often we want someone that is a reflection of who we are. I want someone like me. And there's some often we are just quick to reject or avoid anything that is different from ourselves, even in the leather community. If he's into something different than I'm into, or she's into something different than I'm into, then we're not compatible. I think difference is still a problem, no matter if it's in the leather community, outside of the leather community, within our race or without. People are very uncomfortable with anything that's different.
So, Lynx, can you repeat the question for me again?
Yeah, sure. So why is race such an issue if we are within the leather community, as broad as it is, as inclusive as it is, as welcoming as it claims to be? Why is race such an issue amongst the people who consider themselves to be other, right? We were, like Major Minor said, we are the subgroup of the larger LGBTQ plus community. Why is race still a problem? Why are we still having this conversation if we are our own little group of others? Why is race still an issue?
Okay. I remember reading this question. That was one of the ones that was going to challenge me. This is, okay.
Yeah.
So
here's
what we do. Here's what we do. We partake in entities that we do not own. We are complaining about contests that we do not run. We are complaining about businesses that we do not own. Do we support any of the Black businesses that are of leather, or people of color that exist that are of leather, to the level that we support a Mr. S Leather or any of those other entities? We, and within the LGBT, within the leather community that I'm in, and that we're in, Stephen Major Minor, and a lot of these things pop up at contests. But who's running these contests? Who are the judges? What would make me think that would be any different than what I deal with within the straight community? And I'll be honest with you, I've been discriminated more in the straight community, in my place of businesses where I may work or have worked, than I have in the leather community, because I refuse to give them a scintilla of my spirit and joy to be sucked out by lunacy that has been demonstrated by some behaviors that have come out of this. So my challenge is, and the analysis may be correct, but what do we want? What do we really want in this experience? Because the reality is we don't own these businesses. Why don't we own them? And if we own them, will we support them? We are. Do we want to integrate some of these contests? Okay, we've done it. We've had many titles, and now what? Has that turned into an ownership of a Black entity, a Black contest? I mean, what comes of it? What comes of it? What do we really, really want? And what does it really look like?
Are you asking what do we want in I think the context is contests, right?
Well, that's an example. That's an example. Yeah.
Okay.
That's an example. Yeah.
Yeah, this is also a difficult question for me, Counselor. I agree. We could probably spend quite a bit of time talking about this, but I think at the genesis of it all, it really just goes back to preference. We just kind of talked about it, That preference gets tied up into, okay, your preference becomes your norm, and your norm becomes what looks like racism, especially if it's not. It becomes racism in actions and verbiage, not necessarily just an internal feeling. So yeah, this is a hard question for me because I don't really think that. And I'm just looking at it just to make sure I'm still on context here. Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that one. I just think it really starts with preference and it goes from there.
I think that again too, what we're doing is it's there is a certain part of being human and how we've all been socialized to behave and think. So if you have been colonized to believe certain things the way colonizers
Mhm.
believe, then you're going to bring that with you. Doesn't matter
Mhm.
what your skin color is.
Thank you.
So I
Yes.
think that part of what the issue is that people bring all of their whoever they are, because we bring in our true authentic selves, and some of that true authenticness is shitty. Um, so it's just a matter of just saying, I don't want to be around this person and their authenticity, however it's expressing itself. So
Mhm.
I kind of am a live and let live until you get, and I'm not going to allow you to get close enough to me to cause that type of disturbance in my force, right? So I think it'll always be that, because others, what we talk about is power, and power corrupts. And so the moment you have a bit of it, if you've been oppressed your entire life, you don't know anything else to do with it but to turn around and do the exact same thing that was done to you. And so that is a human condition that, we haven't been able to yet get enough people into therapy to realize that they need to look at themselves and understand that they are perpetuating something that maybe they don't want to, or they don't even realize how internalized that, colonism it really actually is.
Can you imagine a client list, Blue Frost, of those people that need the therapy? Get to
Blue Frost stage, I'll hook you up with some kink aware professionals.
Amen.
I appreciate that in all seriousness.
Yeah.
That's a good resource. And I agree. I work not in a clinical aspect, but I work for one of the mental health hospitals in the state of Ohio. And I'm not speaking on their behalf as a disclaimer, just so, but we cannot also underestimate what trauma does and how long trauma can last with someone and how it governs how they lead their life accordingly. So that's why I get to more the individual aspect of some of these things that may occur regarding race and prejudices and people's attitudes, because um, people's reactions may be based upon trauma that we do or don't know. And as people of color, and I'll go there yet a third time, the Lord will make a way, and and therefore, I'm not going to go to the doctor. What do I need a psychiatrist for? They're not going to understand. We know our pain. Do we know our healing? And do we know how to share that? Sometimes it's a challenge for me because I don't always say that I'm healed, because I'm not. But um, you know, what how do we get to that point of being honest about the pain that we have experienced as people of color? Our sexual orientation is a whole other layer, but we Black first. So how and who do we trust to even say that to? Because there's some unruly doctors out there. So I'm hoping on Blue Frost's links of information, because there's that. And we have misdiagnosis of mental health, diagnosis now anyway. So, and I've got data on where Black folks end up with mental health diagnosis as opposed to white folks. So I, there's some truth there. How do we practice? How do we work on decolonization? And how do we talk about our true pain? And can we?
That's deep. Okay, I'm gonna put a pin in it because that I need to sit with that. Why don't we do our break right now? We'll do a 10-minute. We'll be back. It is 5:05. We'll be back at 5:15 to continue. Wow, that gave me a lot to think about. Thank you guys so much. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Okay, we are back. I'd like to welcome everybody back. We'll give a few seconds to get everybody back in and back on cam, and we'll pick up. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started with the next part of this, and when Counselor's back, he'll just click back on, and we'll continue on. So I want to sort of turn the focus of this conversation to something that sort of exploded earlier in the summer online, and that'll be a discussion around uniforms. Earlier this summer, June, July-ish, there was a big conversation, mostly an argument about the idea of uniforms and its place in the community. So I want to talk a little bit about that because we have people here on panel that have experience in this, and I'm sure some thoughts on it. So what are your thoughts on uniforms, specifically those that are related to law enforcement and how they relate to the lives of Black and Brown people? And I'll let you interpret that however you wish.
Uniforms in what context? In the play scene or in a bar or?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah. So in relation to the visual of the uniform in a bar space, whether or not it's in a scene, I think the scenes are sort of their own sort of thing. You know, the people who are in there, the consent's been discussed and all that. But the idea of just, being a person in a space who happens to see a law enforcement uniform, what are your thoughts just in general on the idea of the uniform and how it's sort of been discussed this summer?
I've seen some of these conversations links, and I'm just not here for kink policing. I'm just not here for it. I mean, one of the reasons why I even express my life choice the way that I do so freely is because I don't ask for permission. I just don't. I don't need anybody's permission to live how I want to live. Now, if a person, okay, let's keep it in the context of the bar. If the bar does not have explicit rules about dress, whether it be no shirts, no shoes, no service, if there's nothing that says that you should not be wearing a uniform, then I don't think the onus is on the patrons to squelch their own kink for the comfort of someone else in a space that is obviously open and acceptable. I just don't believe in
it. Right on.
So I'm sorry I was delayed getting here. The choir was still singing, so they finally stopped. So here's my challenge with this. One of the things my mind goes to if I hear someone express some issue with a uniform, and my listening ears go on, because for me, is there a particular type of trauma that has occurred that would make them react that way to a police uniform? I, being someone who has been profiled by police, I have been pulled over. I've never been arrested, believe it or not, thank God. But I have been challenged by the police because of the color of my skin. And it has affected how I deal with them. But I can differentiate between someone that I know very well who's wearing a uniform, who's not a police officer, as opposed to the police officers that are on the street. So I can navigate and separate the two. I don't have an issue if a leather brother comes into a bar, in a police uniform, and I know of organizations that exist that way. And ironically, one of those organizations said that they wanted to see about getting more Black people in the organization. I thought, and this was before the pandemic. But it is what people do privately is their business, but in a public setting, I think the question becomes, if I'm arriving in a setting where I'm going to see images that are traumatic to me, and understanding this is what we've done as people of color. You know, we'll speak a lot about racism and prejudice, but we call somebody we have the terminology, the boy, the slave. We've got chains and harnesses because we know those are not delivered in hate and racism. We're educated on that. We have that power in that respect. So if someone is expressing an issue, my brain goes to, did something happen that traumatized you with uniforms?
Mhm.
Even the term sir can be traumatizing to some people. So how do we solve that? I don't know if a wholesale, really, you can't wear this uniform is an issue, because last summer, it wasn't about the police, although Black folks, men and folks in general have been dealing with police issues for years. It was the German Gestapo uniform, which is the topic of discussion.
Mhm.
And really also for me, which I appreciated from someone that I know, is skinhead dress. And you have the gay friendly skinheads and then the ones that are not. And I noticed someone had asked me how I felt if they dressed a particular way at a bar and how that would be perceived. I just don't know if we're there. I just don't agree with just saying you can't wear it here and there. However, you know, it is, how do you address people's trauma, or those who are traumatized by those symbols, should they even go to those spaces? I'm not prepared to answer that question, but I'm offering those as questions because I'm going back to, it may be that some of those individuals have a valid trauma to those images.
Mhm.
How do they manage that?
Mm.
Me personally, I wouldn't go to those spaces, but that's me.
Right.
Been
So,
very quiet on this topic because uniforms, when in a bar or public space like that, it's somebody's particular fetish. And if I'm not into that, it still doesn't affect me. So I'm not bothered by it. I will actually like the fact that people are empowered and have the freedom to express themselves and do their own thing, as long as it doesn't affect me. I kind of feel bad for those who are affected by it, seeing it in a bar or whatever. But I don't believe we have the right to ban and stifle that person who is expressing him or herself and their fetish because it makes somebody else uncomfortable.
Mm.
My very presence probably makes somebody uncomfortable. So
Mhm. Mhm.
they have to deal with that. And I'll, I support people and tell them if it just makes you uncomfortable, then you can just step away from it. You don't have to stand in their face. You don't
Right.
have to those who are not comfortable with that uniform don't have to stand next to that person.
right.
So
So that's one of
let
the
me
things I wanted to bring forth is trauma. If you have trauma, then you will have triggers. And
Mhm.
it's important, one, you've made a really big step if you found out what your trigger is. Some folks don't even know, and they
exactly.
those
Yep.
are landmines. That's a little bit different. But if you also know that you have a trigger, then you need to also have a plan for when that happens to you. And
Mhm.
those
Oh,
are things
Mm.
that you and tools that you can get from, again, I'm going to say it one more time, therapy.
Mm.
These are things that are traumas that are within you that need to be healed.
Mhm.
It's a progressive thing that's going to go through with you for the rest of your life. But if you get tools in your toolbox that'll help you address those things, then you'll know what to do. You'll have a plan in place for what to do if you come up against that. You could exit. You can, you may have a safety blanket that you want to use. You might need a lollipop or whatever it is that you need. You'll
Right.
have that thing and you'll know what to do next.
So
that's so
I,
wonderful. Do you have a fight plan first or escape plan first?
Right.
um I I have thoughts about this, so bear with me. So I know the history of the uniform, and I understand that this regalia is inspired by this idea of power and this idea of authority. And some people don't vibe with that. But I think it's about how we orient ourselves with the uniform and how we see the uniform rather than the uniform itself. It's like symbols, right? Symbols indicate certain things. And the more power we give those things, the more those symbols blow up and they become these synonymous things of what that ideal is. I don't, because if the police were wearing, I don't know, boy shorts and bras, would this still be this would still be the same conversation, right? Like, I think it's, yes, it's about triggers, it's about this symbol. And I think the more power we give it, we blow it up. But I think the less power we give it, then the less it becomes a trigger and the less people can kind of identify, okay, well, maybe in this sense, that uniform isn't like synonymous with what we think it is, right? So I feel like, and I think I saw a previous panel where Beacon out of ONYX SoCal said, if it was really about the uniform and it was about the idea of, like, I guess, like fetish, because some individuals have fetish uniforms, if it was really about that, why don't we see other types of uniforms, right? When we go, and I completely agreed with this, and I paraphrasing what he said, when we go to like things like MAL and IML, what do we see across that stage? It's all the same uniform. And because we've gotten used to this idea of that item being synonymous with authority and power. And I think we need to stop giving energy into that and really start including other types of uniforms so that we're not perpetuating that this is okay. This is okay behavior. It's okay to be in a bar space, even though I don't feel like I might be a trigger to somebody. I could possibly be. So I think we need to stop giving energy to the actual uniform and actually focus our energy toward the actual real problem, which is the policing in this country and defunding the police, and just orient other types of uniforms into the leather scene. Like, how many times have you seen a postal worker, which we should be advocating for right now, is a postal worker leather uniform? You know, I would love to see that.
So in some of the spaces I've been in over the years, I'm a uniform enthusiast. I wear a military uniform. The House of Blue is a military style based household, leather household. So I wear a military uniform with the bars and the hat and the whole thing. And I walk.
He is fine.
Yes, I bet.
And I walk through these spaces, and to Major Minor's point, at what point do we draw the line on the energy that's given to the actual cloth versus the actual issue? Mm-hmm. And, you know, even in spaces where I may go to a bar and I may have on a different type of uniform, again, I don't think that as a collective statement that kink shaming or trying to kink squelch or whatever is the way to go. It's just not the way to go. The same conversation can be had about whatever your favorite fetish is in the public scene. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I don't want to see that anymore. Then how are you going to feel about that? Mm-hmm. You know, mm-hmm. So I just go back to my original statement. I do empathize, but I don't think it's okay for us to police the uniform based on the actual feeling behind one person or particular people. There's therapy. There's just the spaces that are appropriate that these things should be in, and if they have to leave, then they have to leave. But for the collective, I just don't think that it's the right thing to do.
Great. There's a follow-up that I want to pose here, and you guys tie right into it, so I'm going to jump right in it. For people who can identify triggers with police uniforms or military uniforms, does the person or people affected by that uniform own the responsibility of removing themselves from that space to avoid being triggered? Or does the onus on that depend on the person who is exhibiting to think of someone other than themselves when they go into a public space where it's not promoted that a uniform may or may not be worn?
So, Lynx, if I can add, I I know we're also talking about uniforms, but a discussion that was occurring last year was about the Confederate flag.
Right.
And about the symbols of such that people may wear as a part of their dress or whatever the case may be. Can you repeat what you asked a second time? Because I want to make sure I say this correctly.
Sure. So if we're in a public space, if we're in a bar or an event or a conference or whatever, does the person who has the issue with the uniform own the responsibility of removing themselves from that space to avoid the trigger? Or does the onus lay on the person who is going to don that uniform to think of other people before themselves? It's just a question.
So I wanted to ask this question, which may tie into this, Links, which has never happened. But if somebody came into a bar, was in the bar in a Ku Klux Klan, mind you, leather uniform, because they apparently had the money to buy it, would we ask that person to leave, or would we leave? Because that's a clear symbol. And if somebody says it's not a uniform, they could say, well, that's our ceremonial dress and whatever the case may be. But what would be the reaction to that?
So being someone who goes to therapy and someone who has dealt with their own mental health issues, it is your responsibility to take care of you, period. It is your response. If you know, even if, like, for example, if you go to bar night, you already know there may be somebody there at bar night that may be wearing a uniform. If that uniform is triggering, you need to know that, okay, one, that is a trigger, like seeing somebody in this regalia is triggering. And two, you put it upon yourself. Am I going to go, or am I going to put things in place so that I'm okay with what's going on? You have to be solely responsible for your own mental health, your own well-being, especially in kink and leather spaces, because it's just that important. And I also think that it's kind of like a two-edged sword, right? If you're going to a bar night and you know that people are going to be wearing this and you're triggered by it, you need to take care of you. But I think it's also who is owning that space for the night. For example, what Counselor said, if it's a ONYX bar night and majority of our members are Black and brown people, and someone shows up in a Ku Klux Klan uniform or that fashion, what do you think is going to happen? Like, we're going to kick you out because we own the space. We own this space. So I think it's about knowing the space that you're going into. And I think it's two ways. If you're going into the space and it's a public space, you have to protect yourself. But if you're part of the collective that is owning the space, you can do whatever you want. If you feel like this person is violating whatever it is of that space that you own or your collective owns for whatever period, kick them out. Because you have to protect the collective.
So my comment is somewhat repetitious, but I'm just going to probably say it in some different words. I think of the person who's actually wearing a uniform. If you put on a uniform, regardless of whether it is military or police or even Klan, you have to be aware of when you walk in, how will you be perceived and how will people respond to you? I think that onus is on the person wearing the uniform. They've got to have some idea where they're going and what they're wearing. On the other hand, though, what they need to be prepared for to receive whatever reaction they're going to get. If it's going to be a military uniform, more often than not, I'm going to honor and respect it because I have a lot of respect for the military. If it's police, it might be a little different. I may not be quite as respectful, but I'm not going to be disrespectful to it. If it's the Klan, that's going to be a whole another thing. So, and all those people need to understand how people are going to respond when they see them walk in with that uniform. Also, though, myself who actually responds to that, I've got to take, as Major Minor said, responsibility for my response. It is not the person's wearing that uniform obligation to take care of me in that situation. They need to be able to prepare to take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a Klan, he might be in trouble in the wrong setting. So he needs to be prepared for that. But we all, though, have some personal responsibility with this. And I think that's a big thing. And owning your reaction, owning what you wear, how you present, and how you respond is something that we all individually have to be responsible for.
Do you think it's fair then that if there's going to be a uniform party, or if it's going to be in a public space, that some sort of advertisement of the uniform should be publicized so that they know whether or not they want to go to the event, whether they want to go to the party, whether they want to go to the bar night? They can see the flyer or they can see the posting or whatever it is and say, oh, they're going to have uniforms. I'm going to sit this one out because I know that's a problem for me. Do you think it's fair to ask the producers or the party planners or whomever they are to promote that so that people are given a fair warning ahead of time so that it's not an ambush as they walk in?
I've never gone to a uniform party that wasn't advertised as just that.
Okay.
So, yeah, I have no problem. Uniform parties and events are advertised for what they are.
Yep.
And people spend a lot of time and attention to make sure that that uniform is clean, pressed, and ready for to be seen. And some of them are amazing.
I think it's also needs to be, I'm sorry, it also needs to be inferenced, because I feel like it's the same, like if you're going to a Halloween party and your trigger is clowns, come on now, like you got to have some sort of inclination that somebody's going to be dressed up as a clown. So I think, yeah, it should be advertised, but I think there's only a certain amount of advertising you can do without somebody thinking to themselves, okay, maybe this isn't an event that I should go to.
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't heard of clowns beating a race of Black people, but that is a good point, Major Minor, that you said. But I where my heart is at is I just want to make sure, and I keep referencing what Blue Frost said as a reference of really finding some healing for what we have been through, particularly as Black men. I'm going to tell you that I felt under siege for many years by the police as a Black man because of my experiences. I'm not triggered by a uniform in a fetish setting, but I am on alert in a uniform out in the regular world. I have a whole set of processes I go through and how to deal with it, depending upon how the situation rolls, if I even see a police officer. There may be other people who don't have that. And hopefully, as Blue Frost talked about, finding those tools in which to deal with that, as we want to get to, because you could take the uniform away, but that doesn't remove the trauma. It doesn't go to the path of healing in those tools, as she said, to get to the point to deal with this in the future. Because if you don't want to see somebody in a uniform, you might as well just stay home and not go out.
Right. Yeah.
So how are you going to function in the real world?
And I think also, though, that it's, I don't want to say unfair, but my own 2 cents. If we expect the person donning the uniform to be psychic and be aware of everyone's potential trigger in that room, that's impossible. There's no way that a person or a pair can know what will offend every single person that they may or may not come in contact with. So I agree that I think that, the onus is up on the individual person to know what'll send them off or what won't, and to adjust accordingly. Granted, the spaces that we work in the community are deemed safe, right? And we do the work that we need to do to make sure that they are as safe as possible. We still need to take inventory of self to know that if I'm going to go to this event, I need to be aware that such and such may be in a such and such, and be prepared for that. That's the homework that individuals need to do for themselves and not really expect someone else to do for them. But again, this is one of those places where I think empathy comes into play too. If I know that this uniform may trigger someone, do I just say forget it and do my thing, or does that come into the planning of what I'm going to wear? I don't know. You know, I think that we don't want to kink shame and we don't want to tell anyone how to express themselves, but we do want people to be able to come together and not have to create separate spaces for every single individual idea within the community, because we need 10,000 bars per city to accommodate everyone's individuality. We don't want to segregate the community, I don't think.
So one of the things I would say to that, Links, is then what these events need, and dare I say this, is somebody competent enough to practice the appropriate de-escalation or intake techniques if and when these things occur at the event. Mm-hmm. And the person taking money at the door is not necessarily the person to de-escalate an event necessarily. Then you probably need somebody professionally to do that, which is an opportunity for discussion and learning. Because what these events are, take the money, come in the door, and then leave. And if somebody is traumatized or something occurs, they themselves do have to take care of themselves. However, I think that those events have a responsibility.
To your point, Counselor, there does need to be some type of mechanism put in place to receive and address those issues, much like you mentioned. What some of you may not know is I don't consider myself a producer, but I am the vice president of MTTA, which produces the Master Slave Contest, which generally has over 500 people in attendance each year. Conference, I'm sorry. And we have something in place for just this, type of situation. If someone comes in and there's a trigger and they want to address or at least say, hey, there's this thing going on at your conference and it's triggering me, and here's the reasons why, we have a whole team set up to deal with that. I'm not saying that we can do that at the micro level at a bar, but some type of mechanism does need to be there to be able to address and hear the concerns of the patrons that are coming to the event.
I would say that most club managers have some protocol in place if there's a problem, whether it's trauma, a fight, something illegal brought into the place, someone who just, is drunk and disorderly. There's almost always a plan and someone who is responsible to manage it. I've never been to a bar where that wasn't the case. Even if you don't see it.
We'd like to see how they were trained. I would like to see what entity trained them in which to do it, and whether it's a certified entity on mental health. That just saying.
Every establishment is different. That's.
Yeah, since we're talking about spaces, I think this is a good segue into the last few questions that we have for today's talk. It's going to be about the idea of spaces and the span of gender and its expression. Do you guys feel like the use of separate spaces, bars, community space, play space, across gender identity, or gender expression is okay? Or do we need to work toward the idea that we are all welcome in the same space at the same time?
I have been to a lot of events that offer I guess call it three spaces: a men's space, a women's space, and then a pan or open space, whatever you want to call it. So that's a really high level of giving people with their own gender identity a place to play where they can feel comfortable. Now, what happens behind those closed doors is only going to be the business of the people that have consented to walk through the door to see what's going on. Once you consent and walk through that door, whatever's going on is going to be going on, and however you deal with it is like, the gentleman said, it's up to you to get yourself out of that space if it's not a place where you feel comfortable. But to just put one big open space for everybody to do all of their things, I don't necessarily say that's a bad idea, but I think you're looking at inviting a little bit more differences in comfortability and expression than you would if you did not give people at least a box that they feel comfortable in by gender identity and expression. Now, that also goes down to the conversation of what do you do with your non-binary folks? People that don't have one specific gender identity. What do you do for them? That's a
Mm-hmm.
whole other conversation. But the answer is still just give them a space, everybody a space where they feel comfortable in the skin that they're in.
Yeah, I think it's important that people be able to have their own spaces and be inclusive in those spaces because they understand each other best,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It might be where you can feel supported in order to step out into a more inclusive space. So I think that all of these spaces are necessary because if you only stay in your space, you won't get any context or understanding or perspective from any other space. So you won't be able to it's like kindergarten. You got to learn how to share and work well with people. So we'll have to eventually be in that open space, but to know that you do have a place you can fall back on that is for you, designed for you, and where you can be your most true self and where you can, be the most safe. I think that's important. Can all of those things happen at one time in one, space or event or whatever? I'm not so certain that is the case, but I do think that it's important for exclusivity and that people can be all together and or separate if that's what they choose.
Mm. So providing a menu, so to speak, of options for people.
Who doesn't like options?
Yeah, right. Indeed. Ochumaré, did you want to say something? I saw your hand.
No, I echo exactly what they're saying. I think it's necessary to have both. I think it's so necessary to have both because only people, no offense, but people that look like you understand what it is that you're going through. People that you can relate to on a deeper level, and having a space where you can share that is so important rather than being in the collective. Although being in the collective is a place where you share these ideas and you share these ideals, and that's also very important based just for the development of the community, right? So that I think shared spaces along with prioritized spaces for how you identify or where you feel like your truest self belongs is completely necessary.
I went to
That's wonderful. It just gets difficult when you go to any one establishment and require them to be all of those things. As long as a business actually owns who they are, whether it's a women's space, a men's space, or a pan space, if they own it and make sure that it is safe, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. It would be wonderful if we had all of those spaces. What it really tells us is that we need multiple spaces, that it's just one space is not going to be all of those things. And I think we put an unfair burden on a lot of establishments, trying to tell them that you have to be all things to everybody. That's a tall order.
I'm going to rely a little bit on Frost's memory, but I can recall going to we're in the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. I'm sorry if he's an acronym for people that don't know what that means. We're in Maryland, but some years ago, and this is the only time this happened, I went to the Baltimore Playhouse, and I forget what the actual event was, but in that event, Baltimore Playhouse, for people that don't know, is a huge open space. I saw Men of ONYX, I saw men of MDHL, I saw the women of ONYX, ONYX Pearls, I saw some ladies from the Dyke Uniform Corps, I saw some ladies from Mistresses in DC, all in the same place, all at the same time, all kinking and have a good time at the same time. It was phenomenal. Right. You don't see it all the time, but it can happen. Weekend Reunion is another institution that's no longer around, but those spaces were open for anybody and everybody's sexual expression, identification, and kink play however you wanted to do it. And it worked fine. That event went on for 4 years? 4 or 5 years. And it worked. So the question of whether or not it can work, yes. The whether or not we should have those spaces, yes, absolutely.
And I would actually like to challenge a lot of these spaces that if you're watching or if they're watching, to make these spaces, if you do have a combined space or a space where everyone collects, make it welcoming to everybody. Make it really welcoming to everybody. And that includes people that are trans or non-binary. It's like I feel like in this community we sometimes forget to include them in the space or have the mindset to be like, okay, we need to make this welcoming for them as well. I feel like that's also necessary. So I challenge a lot of people who create spaces or people that own spaces to make sure that you're welcoming to everybody across the board.
So what I would say is, to these businesses, and it goes back to something that I said previously, if you don't have a valued relationship with the people that you say that you want to build these spaces for, it's going to fail. I don't expect a business to say, I'm going to put up a binary play space if they have no engagement with the people that they're building this for. And really that engagement even includes asking them, A, do they want a play space? B, what do they want? And maybe having somebody help organize that. It's as if I'm going to ask somebody, and I say this very carefully, a white male to create a Black-only play space for me. Absolutely not. And it's not because I'm bigoted or prejudiced. It is because that person could be somebody that he's had little to no relationship with people of color than what he's seen in a bar setting or so forth. So some of these businesses can do it if they're competent enough to do it. Others, I don't think they're competent enough to do it, and I'd rather they not go there until they have the competency within their ranks in order to create an appropriate play space. So I'm for cultural competency. It's a term I'm going to use for them to be able to do that. If they don't have it, people will create their own play spaces and let them. And they should be separate play spaces.
Thank you, Counselor. We have 2 more questions to go. These are, I would like to hear from each of you on these because these are very personal and I think individual in response. The first one, do you feel that you are your complete and authentic self in spaces where you find that you're the minority? Do you feel that you can be all of you when you go in there and you look around? Like you said, Mr. Blue, you can recall being the only Black person in a group of hundreds of other people at that time. And then for the rest of you, when you walk into a space and you realize, oh, I'm the only Black, or I'm the one of 2 Black people here, do you find that you're your authentic self? And for the people that say, no, I don't, what can we do to help them get there?
In a word, yes. I don't put a facade on for people at all. I just don't. And that's not a macho statement. It's a statement of reclaiming my own space and time. That's what that statement means. So yes, when I've been in those spaces and I've been the only person of, hundreds or whatever it might be, I am my authentic self, but I also understand that there is a big spotlight on my back and on my face. I completely know that from the time I walk out of the room to the time I get back in my room, all eyes on me. And I get that. And I know that. And
what does that do to you? What does that do to you? Does it do anything to you?
It's stressful.
Okay.
It's stressful. It's you've been there. It's stressful because you have to think about the people that aren't, I said this earlier, the people that aren't there that look like you. The impression that I leave on the person that is emboldened enough to come up and have a conversation with me is going to be the impression they're going to take back and may assign to a whole bunch of people that they may not deserve that assignment.
Right. So we strive to be our higher selves, not necessarily not authentic, but there are places where you want to say, please get out of my face or whatever else, but you won't, and you won't do it because, as Michelle Obama says, you go high, right? So there are places where that going high is not always my authentic self, okay? So I would say that, no, I'm not always my authentic self. I am the highest version of myself that I can be because people may not see another Black woman slave for another 20 years or whatever the case may be in their area. So I'm going to be the highest form of myself so that they can get an idea of what that means to me, what that means on a higher level. Like if we're the only Black folk that they come in contact with in a leather place, I don't want them to think that all Black leather folk, do whatever it is I may have done that night, right? So
Right.
I endeavor to be just the best, highest version of myself, because I know there's a whole generation behind me, and there's a whole group of people here now that's going to benefit from me being the highest form of myself, instead of me taking a lower road that, may not get us as progressively forward as I would prefer us to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I have done this so many times. Lynx, I've lost count as to how many times I've walked into spaces where I've been the only or one of the few.
Mm-hmm.
My college years in Cincinnati kind of helped put me in the space that I am now that many years ago in the mid 80s. And I'm 55 right now. Is that I don't walk into these spaces with fear. I refuse. It's part of what I said before. I've given somebody else power if I'm walking in there thirsty. I don't go into these places thirsty, just like I don't go into the grocery store hungry. And what they see is what I choose them to see. What they see is somebody who they can't immediately claim. They can't, simply because of the way that I carry myself. And in fact, what ends up happening is that more often than not, people are afraid to come up to me, and I could care less. But I, I'm not threatening, but I'm me. I have resting blackface. I don't so it's like, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? Not a damn thing. And I won't do a damn thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, what the challenge when you talk about what we have to do is we come into these spaces and we're expected to say hello to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to the business host or the party host being such a thing as called a host and welcoming me in and encouraging those conversations. And bar settings are the worst. But they see the part of me that has been through enough. You've run out of stuff you could do to me, and they're coming in and I don't drink alcohol, which, the bartenders may hate me because of that. But I don't come in there thirsty, and I can leave. And there's one time for me in my life that changed significantly was I went to a gay bar in Cleveland, and it was during New Year's Eve. And I was alone. The clock struck 12, and there were people around that were, wishing each other Happy New Year, and other people that were standing against the walls that were sad because they were by themselves. I said Happy New Year to a couple of people, and I left. And I probably left at like 12:10 or 12:15. I was okay. I went home, went to sleep, best sleep I ever had in a long time. And the next day was wonderful. And then I realized that I could walk in there and have all of these feelings of wanting and needing the space and wanting company and all this other stuff. But I had to love me and deal with me, because that's who I'm going to be spending most of the time with. When I got to that point, the next time I come into these bars, it's like, okay. And then I can leave and be fine. When you walk in, I walk in such confidence that you could walk out in 5 minutes and be okay.
My experience has been all over the place, having been the only dark face in the room many, many times. And I've been pretty comfortable with that, because I didn't depend on the people there to validate me. I could walk on in and feel validated myself. Otherwise, if I didn't feel good about it, I wouldn't have been there. So I'm comfortable in those spaces, and I don't think it's everybody else's responsibility to to validate me. I think it's nice to be welcomed and appreciated, and because that's just what good hosts do,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what good businesses do, and that's how good parties are managed. But for me individually, I don't have to feel like I have to change who I am to make somebody else comfortable. That's number one.
Yeah.
I can be me, and it's not my responsibility to make other people comfortable. So I'm very comfortable walking in, being myself, enjoying myself, having the best time. I do understand sometimes when you're the only dark face in the room that everybody looks at you and they think that you represent, and whatever you do, all Black people do that. So you are carrying a certain amount of weight. So I am mindful to actually carry myself in such a way that I don't embarrass myself, or worse yet, embarrass my mother, because she's the one person who can shame me. And so, I don't worry about that. I think I'm comfortable going into those other spaces because I think I'm not depending on how they respond to me to have a good time.
Cool. Major, minor, anything?
I kind of echo exactly everything that these wonderful people have said. When you're the only person in the room, I think, what do they call it? Code switching, where it's like you got to kind of navigate it at your best instead of the most authentic. And I will say that much. If I'm the only person of color, or at least the only Black male in the space, I am definitely not my most authentic self. Not if I was in a room with my peers, right? And I think there is this certain level of expectation that you instantly feel when you walk into a space. Like, there's certain things that I wouldn't say, there's certain things that I wouldn't do. But I think with understanding, I guess with age, you kind of just get used to it. You just kind of get used to it. You kind of just acknowledge it, and you kind of process it, and it is what it is. And you just move forward with, that's how you have to be. Yeah, I found myself in plenty of spaces where I've been the only Black male, and sometimes I'm the only gay Black male in the space. So that means, like, sometimes, like, I have to kind of navigate that a whole nother way. And I think that, yeah, I think with a certain level of understanding, the more you put yourself out there, the more you just get used to it, and you know how to navigate that space a lot better.
Thank you. This is our last question for the discussion, and I saved it for last because I think that, well, you'll see. To each and every one of you, and I'd appreciate a response from everyone. What does a fair and inclusive leather culture look like to you? Anyone can go first.
That's a broad question for me.
It is, right?
Because I have such low expectations. Oh my goodness, because it's almost as if you're asking for something that we've never seen. Have we ever lived in a world where there's been no prejudice and racism? And it's not necessarily in another country. So, it is, you know what, I want, what it looks like to me, if we have enough people that are expertise in listening and leading people to paths to healing. Because in order for me to say it would be just and fair, then everybody's traumas would have to be gone, and everybody would have a title or not, or whatever the case may be. I think the root of it is, I will feel comfortable when we have the tools in place, or the avenues in place, particularly as people of color, to find those places to heal and to get healing professionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, however the case may be. And then I could think about whether, you know, what a just or fair place looks like. It's difficult when I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's always been there in some form or another.
I didn't think this was a difficult question, but I did think it's a rare thing to find. A space that's inclusive would make everyone welcome, regardless of their gender or sexual orientation, where we could have no age discrimination, no body shaming, no, and everyone was free to be whoever they are. You could come just as you are, whether you were a experienced kinkster or a really vanilla novice. Everyone would be welcome across the spectrum. And I think that's an easy thing to aspire to and hope for and envision. Unfortunately, it's just a rare thing to find, and that's disappointing. But I can imagine it easily. And actually, I'll go further. I think we should work towards that. I think it's something we should aspire to.
Sorry, I have a dog.
Two-legged, four-legged dog.
I do, yeah. Shush. Sorry about that. Mr. Blue Frost, Major Minor, any thoughts?
I'm struggling with words, because everybody. I mean, communication is just
Shush.
extremely important, especially when you're trying to relay information or try to, you know, make sure someone understands something. So here's what I'm struggling with. The sentence says, what does a fair and inclusive leather culture look like to you? The word that I have an issue with in that is fair. That's what the issue is for me. What's fair? Because we already talked about how kink and BDSM is a subculture of the greater vanilla culture. So it's already inclusive, but it's not fair. That's the problem. So much like Counselor said, the conversation starts way back here when you flatten everyone's experience to be the same. And how do you do that? There's just no real good answer for that. So I struggle with the word fair in language to how do we even get there? Past prejudices, past preferences, past all the other things we've been talking about for the last 2 hours. So that's where my struggle is. I do believe that it can happen, but much like with anything else, it starts small and it grows. So it's a seed that we have to plant, which we're doing now, and practice and grow and feed like we're doing now, to hopefully it will grow to something that we can actually actualize in some years. But that fair thing is a struggle for me.
Yeah, and the leather culture in general is a rebellious culture. And so when you try to set down a whole lot of rules, we're not like those people who really want to follow those things that are put forth. So it makes it difficult. But what I will say, when we talk about doing things in small ways that can turn into bigger things. So like with I'll give a quick example with the leather family that we are a part of. It's super inclusive. We're actually the youngest on the totem pole of people there. I mean, we have kinksters in their 70s who are still playing. You know, we have all of those things. So it's, for me, I think it's very important that if you can do it in your life, if you can just navigate in your life to make it your treatment of the people you come in contact with fair and inclusive, then moving forward, the spaces will grow into that. Because if this is the way that I'm holding myself and accountable, and that's my integrity, to treat all people with fairness and inclusiveness and with kindness, then that's hopefully is something that can echo out and become behavior that other people model, other people do, and then, you know, generationally, hopefully down the line, it could turn into something, you know, great. But it starts with a personal responsibility to be that with which you want.
Yeah.
What was it? Wasn't it Michael Jackson that said you have to start with the man in the mirror.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
I love it.
It's just that simple, right? It's exactly what Frost was saying. It's like you have to be the catalyst that starts the change. If you want to see an inclusive environment, what are you doing yourself to make that environment inclusive? How are you
besides complaining and posting on Facebook about it, right?
right? Besides complaining and posting on Facebook,
Right. Yeah.
but yeah, what are you doing in your own community, in your own space, in your own home? Like, what are you doing to create this movement of inclusivity? Like, what are you doing? And I think the more we focus on ourselves and focus on what we are doing and what we are cognizant, like what we actually put out there, the more that energy grows and the more people become part of that energy, part of that collective. Yeah, that's it's just that simple.
I love it. Thank you guys. We're at the end. That was it, because I think that if we continue on, we'll be into Sunday, and I think that each of us has something to do this evening, if only but to rest. So as we make our way toward the end of this discussion, I want to take a moment and thank each and every one of you for sharing a little bit of time with us today, and the people out there who are watching, because I think there was some knowledge and there was some gospel in what you guys all said, and I definitely was able to learn something new from each of you. So thank you. I want to also thank our interpreters today. Thank you very much for your skills and your talents. Thank you so very much. To the Men of ONYX Mid-Atlantic, thank you for creating this space for us to have these talks and these dialogues, because I think that each of you are right. It starts with us, and then it sort of reverberates outward, you know. So thank you for being able to allow us to have this kind of conversation. If anyone is interested in ONYX, if you don't know who we are, check out the website, onyxmen.com. You can find out different chapters around the country. Is anyone here on panel opposed to people who may see you and want to reach out because of something you've said and want to have a conversation sidebar? May they reach out to you or not? I don't know. Because some people will respond to us and say, hey, such and such said something. I want to ask them more about that. Do they have permission to do that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
They have it from me, and I'm hoping to get some information from Blue Frost for sure.
There you go.
Therapy links, most definitely.
Indeed. All right. Well, with that, I want to say thanks once more. I really appreciate it. And I do believe that those viewers that are joining us also appreciate it. In a month's time, we'll continue on with the conversation in part 4. We're going to hone in and talk a little bit about the ism effect. I'll tell you more about that in the coming weeks, but it's going to be just as exciting as this one was. We're going to talk about isms and what that means, and how the Black church has affected sexuality and what it means to be. Oh yeah, we're gonna go there. So look forward to that in about a month. But for now, we're going to sign off. Again, thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend, and God bless.
Thank you. Love you all.
Love
Thank
you
you
more.
so much.
Thank you for